What is the point of Deltarune's continuation? Oh my god, it's here, barreling in like a bumper car. Toby Fox finally did what we've all lost hope of Valve doing and dropped a new chapter of Deltarune a mere 2 days after announcing it. I'm hyped, you're hyped, everyone's hyped, but at the back of my mind I'm a little worried. Because sure, more content from Toby Fox always fills the void in my little red soul, but Deltarune Chapter 1 was kinda fine on its own? Yeah, I know it ended with a sequel hook and everything, but hear me out. Obviously, a world without any more Deltarune would be a tragedy, but I also think what we got could be considered a perfectly self-sufficient gaming snack. It played around with the preconceived notions we walked in with from Undertale, it expanded its battle system and pushed it to its limit with the Jebel fight, and the story about the Closet Dark World was a nicely contained little tale about a tyrannical king being taken down and his delightfully bouncy son becoming a villainous force for good. And more importantly, we got a complete character arc out of Susie, as she went from a terrifying school thug to a chaotic wannabe villain to a real hero. So I started to get that very specific anxiety normally reserved for a sudden sequel to a years-old movie I loved. But really, I should have had more faith in Toby and his team. The problem with those sequels is always that the original story was written to be self-contained, and the writers have to figure out a way to squeeze a new story out of a setting where everything was built around having just one. That's how you end up with the most common type of delayed sequel, the retread. Couples that got together at the end are broken up, the plot covers largely the same beats, and at the end you're basically back where you started. The obvious way to leave things open to a sequel is to have some dangling story threads, but the real key to a successful series is to leave real room for growth. And if the character development from the first story isn't just basic flaw scrubbing, the possibilities can get pretty interesting. Enter Deltarune Chapter 2. The day after the events of Chapter 1, which you should probably just replay before going into this one because it sure assumes you did, Chris and Susie stumble upon another dark world enveloping the library's computer lab. They go on a journey through an early 2000s style cyberspace city to save some other characters who got embroiled in the conflict, all under the shadow of Queen, the robotic Wynaught Ojo acting as the local tyrant. The same combat is back from Chapter 1, which I've gone on record saying I like a lot. Jrpg Combat has never exactly lit my fire, but with the addition of bullet hell dodging and a full party take on Undertale's whole spare system, it's definitely fun, if not necessarily challenging most of the time. The second chapter doesn't evolve it much, only adding a visible bar for how close you are to sparing an enemy and later giving your party members the ability to act, something that was previously restricted to the player character. As it stands, I have mixed feelings. Undertale's gameplay mainly hinged on the dichotomy of genre-expected turn-based combat subverted with the ability to befriend enemies. Deltarune wisely dropped the whole spare kill dynamic since there was no longer a surprise to it, instead focusing on making it a bit more complex. You can still attack instead of act, and the game just kinda sweeps it under the rug. Sparing an enemy was generally more straightforward, but fighting multiple enemies at once made it interesting. That's what makes the mercy meter in Chapter 2 a bit odd. It feels like a health bar by another name, if that makes sense. It makes combat feel a little more routine, especially since you face the same enemies multiple times a little more frequently. It's never that much harder, usually. It just feels like it could have had another step up, either on a story or gameplay level. But the new acts in combat are still entertaining, and the boss fights are as inventive as they've ever been, so I won't discuss them any further so as not to spoil. I'm much more interested in the grand overarching question. What is the point of— okay, yeah, you get the idea. Susie was always the one I was most intrigued about going into this game, as continuing with her would be deceptively difficult. To not honestly that much surprise, she's pretty great in Chapter 2. In fact, I'd go as far as to say she might be the heart of the story going forward. She's still a boisterous punk, but also a successful hero, and this chapter sees her facing situations head-on where both people she cares about and people she's just come to know are in trouble. She takes a lot more initiative this time around, and being significantly more talkative than Chris and more outspoken than Raine, it's often her reaction to any given situation that we hear first. That's usually the job taken by the protagonist, but she makes it work. Raine is another potentially interesting case, but I get the feeling it'll take another chapter or two to really get a solid hold on our resident fluff. This development in the story alone assures me that the second chapter is a worthy continuation rather than a retread. And even beyond that, we still have the moment-to-moment experience of simply existing in this universe. There's now a fairly settled format between the two games of a wacky journey through some themed area while a charismatic villain toys with you, up until the big boss fight where things typically get a bit more serious. From the likes of Papyrus and Metaton to Lancer and now Queen, who's possibly the funniest of all of them so far. Like with Chapter 1, there's only hints towards the end of things going darker. This game seems to be teetering on whether it'll just be a wholesome adventure or have a more sinister undercurrent like its predecessor. That's certainly something that I hope for, but at the end of the day, the character writing is always what made Undertale stick. And like I said last time, if it can strike a chord with people using that alone, then that's a victory. Remember, we aren't going to see anything that makes us feel the same way Undertale did, and Toby's not aiming for that. But I think he's proven that he can make us feel something else. Well, that about wraps it up for today. I've been Rycluse, and this is my chance to be a big shot— Wait. If your instinct at hearing that outro was not to rush down to the comments and say, why didn't you talk about that part, Recluse? You know, that part. Then this is your spoiler warning, because we have a bit more to discuss, and I don't want it to reach sensitive ears, okay? What in the goddamn fuck was going on with the Snowgrave route? In my old DDLC video, I coined the term hidden horror to talk about games with delayed horror elements that are hidden behind other more innocuous genres. The original idea I had for this concept was from an old Cracked.com article, which proposed the idea of a game that seems entirely on the level, and can even be completed without anything scary happening, but straying off the beaten path is where it really gets wild. The idea stuck with me, even though I agreed with the article thinking it could never truly happen, and would only be relegated to small scenes like that optional bit with Flowey and Undertale. But I'll be damned if Deltarune doesn't kind of pull it off. As basically the entire fandom knows by now, Deltarune has a hidden route. It's triggered not by the systematic killing of enemies, but by, forcing your innocent cinnamon roll of a party member to systematically kill enemies. Over and over, until her mind breaks and she becomes an obedient killer, serving your wishes. An underappreciated aspect of Undertale's No Mercy route was that despite how gruesome it was, the extreme situation showed you who your friends really were. It showed you how Papyrus believed in everyone until the bitter end, and how Undyne had strength within herself beyond what we thought possible. There was a macabre beauty to it, how some of the best writing in the game was reserved for these characters acting in spite of you. And what's more, a lot of the lore dropped in this route was essential to understanding the full scope of the story. In the same way, it feels like without the Snowgrave route, in addition to the secret encounters with Spamton, you don't really get the story of Deltarune. The basic ending of the game progresses the main plot and further establishes the link between Chris and the Knight that Queen only hinted at, but these secret scenes point to a far bigger story, one that seems to be getting every bit as meta as the classic tale of the fallen child. If we revisit the question of the point of Deltarune one last time, now we finally have something interesting to go on. There's clearly a bit of genre deconstruction going on here, this time with how you control the every move of your RPG party members. And also, psychological abuse, which was somehow way more disturbing than all the murder last time around. But what's important is we're starting to see the various elements of Deltarune come together into some coherent themes. There's stuff in here about escapism, the good and bad types of relationships people have, and most interestingly, choice and free will. That's right, despite the whole choices don't matter spiel from the first chapter, there are some implications here that they may have just been a setup for a much longer thematic arc. The most interesting detail being the two optional bosses, both confined and deprived of that choice. Jevil deludes himself into thinking he's the only one that's free, while Spamton struggles relentlessly in futility against his bindings. Add to this the fact that it's starting to look like Chris and the player are separate and possibly opposed entities, and I think we've got some interesting things to look forward to in the coming chapters. You know, in 3 years or however long. Long enough for me to finish up this damn Phoenix Point video for sure, and like 2 more after that. Yeah. Look forward to it. I've been Recluse, your favorite
#1 rated salesman 1997.
Thanks for watching.